I think all of our guests are in from the waiting room. So once again, good afternoon. My name is Sarah Linda Lickblau, Director of Education here at the Hudson River Museum. And the first order of business is to welcome you to this virtual panel discussion, Bridging the Wall, and to introduce you to Luis Lopez, who will be providing simultaneous interpretation for today's program. Luis?
Hello, good afternoon, buenas tardes, y gracias por acompañarnos. Thank you for being here with us. The program today will be presented in English, but we're providing Spanish language interpretation simultaneously. So I will give the instructions in Spanish. If there's a chance that we may switch to Spanish at some points in the presentation, you can also activate your English interpretation if you're connected via Zoom. And I will put those instructions in the chat as well in writing. They're pretty straightforward, but I will also go over them verbally in a second. But let me catch up in Spanish first. Buenas tardes, bienvenidas, bienvenidos. El programa de hoy será la mayoría en inglés y estamos ofreciendo interpretación en español. Acabo de poner las instrucciones de cómo conectarse en el chat, pero también les explico ahora, después de cuando termine de hablar yo, aparecerá un icono de un globito en la base de su pantalla. Pueden pinchar en el globo y verán que tienen las opciones de interpretación. Seleccionen Spanish o español y luego seleccionen Done o terminado, y ahí ya empezarán a escuchar cuando la gente esté hablando en inglés, podrán oírme a mí interpretando en español al mismo tiempo. No tienen, si cambia el lenguaje al español de la presentación en algún momento, no tienen que tocar nada más porque simplemente yo no estaré hablando por ese canal. All right, y muchas gracias. Si tienen algún problema, pueden mandarme un mensaje o mandarle un mensajito en directo a Olivia, por favor. So in English, if you wanted to connect your interpretation in case there's a segment in Spanish that you'd like to hear in English, you can select the globe that will appear at the bottom of your screen and select English. And after that, when folks are speaking English in the main presentation, you will not need to touch or move anything else because it will only be there, just activated for when it's necessary. Thank you very much. If you have any issues with this, please send me a direct message or you can send Olivia a direct message. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis. And once again, welcome everyone to today's program, Bridging the Wall. This is the latest in our series of programs that are inspired by our current exhibition, Border Cantos, Sonic Border, Richard Mizrach, Guillermo Galindo, which is on view at the museum through May 9th of this year. And right up front, I'd like to thank our partner Art Bridges for its generous support of this and other programming in connection with the wonderful exhibition, which we do hope all of you will be able to attend. So today, Kenneth Smith Ramos, former Chief Negotiator for the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement for the Government of Mexico, and currently a partner at AGON, a Mexican consulting firm, will speak on the economic, sociological, and political factors that drive immigration. He's joined today by Enrique Perret Erhard, director of the US-Mexico Foundation, who will focus on the efforts to promote dialogue and cooperation between our two countries by creating new connections through humanitarian, cultural, economic, and academic initiatives. And their conversation will be moderated by our director and CEO, Masha Turchinsky. Now for a little bit of housekeeping just before we start. The audience has been muted upon entry, but we can see you unless you turn off your videos. We love to see you, so thank you for being here and showing yourselves. We are happy to welcome, we invite and encourage your comments and your questions in the chat. And please, as they occur to you, type them in the chat, and we will be looking at them throughout the program and addressing them as they become relevant. At this point, we again, are happy to have you. Welcome, thank you. And I turn the program over to our moderator, Masha Turchinsky. Masha.
Thank you so much, Sarah Linda, and good afternoon y buenas tardes a todos. Como una forma de respeto no solo a nuestros invitados, pero también igual a nuestro público, quiero empezar en español y después vamos a seguir en inglés, ¿vale? Quiero decir muchas gracias hoy a todo nuestro público y también a los invitados Kenneth Smith Ramos y Enrique Perret. Hoy vamos a dialogar acerca de la historia de la inmigración entre México y los Estados Unidos y sus implicaciones en materias económica y social. Hablaremos también acerca de las perspectivas para fortalecer la cooperación entre los socios entre los países. Y también yo creo que es muy importante no solo hablar de los grandes desafíos, pero también hablaremos acerca del optimismo que tenemos para el futuro entre nuestros países. Okay? Bien, how did I do, Luis? Adelante, no? Okay, we're going to continue, and what I'd like to do now is take this opportunity to introduce you to our distinguished guests. Kenneth Smith Ramos is the former Chief Negotiator of the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement for the Government of Mexico and currently a partner at AGON, a Mexican consulting firm. He specializes in competition, regulatory affairs, international trade, and he focuses on helping international clients identify trade and investment opportunities derived from the new generation of FTAs that Mexico has negotiated, such as the CPTPP and the Mexico-United States FTA. Ken also advises clients who face trade barriers and assists them in developing strategies to obtain and expand access into key international markets, including Mexico. Prior to joining AGON, Ken served as Mexico's chief negotiator for the modernization of the North American Free Trade Agreement that led to the signing of the USMCA. I'd also now like to take this opportunity to introduce Enrique Perret. Enrique Perret is the director of the US-Mexico Foundation. He has a history of deep commitment to the US-Mexico bilateral relationship. He is a former government professional with a strong track record of leading government engagement and business development strategies between Mexico and the US. Before joining the USMF, Enrique most recently served as the director for North America at ProMéxico, Mexico's trade promotion agency, where he worked for more than 10 years in various positions. He has a very strong commitment to civil society endeavors and has served in leadership roles at a number of nonprofits, including as chair of the board of Enseña for Mexico and Teach for All's Mexican affiliate, an organization dedicated to leadership development and promoting a better education for all. I am absolutely delighted to have these two international experts with us here at the Hudson River Museum as we think about very deeply the issue of migration, not only as it relates to its history, but how it has evolved and the conversations that we are having that are still very much in play in our modern times. So what I'd like to do is jump right in because I have a feeling this is going to be a very lively conversation. And we have two people who have professional and personal experiences thinking about the borderlands, la frontera, right? And we're really excited to get this started. So what I'd like to do is start by asking Ken, please, if you could provide us with some context. Can you start us out in helping us understand the history of migration between Mexico and the United States?
Absolutely, Masha. Thank you very much. First of all, let me thank the Hudson River Museum for the opportunity to be with you here today. Thank you, Masha, for the invitation to share a little bit of our thoughts on the history and economics of immigration and in the context that we live on right now and between Mexico and the US is very important. So let me begin by just basically saying as an opening statement that the main drivers for immigration between Mexico and the US is essentially the search for educational and economic opportunity. So So people leave their places of origin because they need to, not because they want to. This is the majority of the immigrants that that leave, in the case of Mexico, to go to the United States. It's because of economic need and the search for a better life, better educational opportunities. It's very interesting to realize that in Mexico, we saw a phenomenon towards the mid-century, mid-20th century, of domestic migration. At the turn of the 20th century, Mexico was basically a rural population of, that focused primarily in agricultural activities. And there were some major urban centers, of course, but more than 60% of the population was rural in the 1940s. This began to change with a domestic migration towards urban centers in Mexico as the population grew. And by the 50s and 60s, we also began to see quite a bit of immigration, temporary immigration into the United States because of the bracero programs, which was the first guest worker programs in the agricultural sector. And when California became, in the mid-century, sort of the garden of the US fruits and vegetables, a lot of demand for agricultural workers grew in that state, and you began to see more and more immigration. Now, in Mexico, there were major economic crises in the 70s and 80s that led to a peak rise in immigration towards the United States. And what we began to see in the 70s and 80s is the beginning of movements. For one thing, movements in the United States since the 60s and 70s to organize migrant workers through great leaders like Cesar Chavez and others. And in Mexico, an effort to try to find a solution to this issue where a lot of Mexicans had to leave to go up north to be able to make a living. Now, when Mexico, we have to understand Mexico was a very closed economy until the early 90s, when we began opening up the economy to international trade, liberalizing our economy in terms of the ability to enter into our main trading partner, into the US market, and also opening up our economy. That led to a huge level of inflows of investment in manufacturing in Mexico. So we used to receive less than $2 billion a year in investment in Mexico prior to the entry into effect of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, that came into effect in 1994. And by 2018, that yearly figure was 35 billion US dollars. What this did is generated a lot of investment in factories, in maquiladoras, a lot of production in the northern states of Mexico, in sectors such as automotive, aerospace, machine and equipment, electronics, steel, textiles, and a lot of employment began to flow into that region of Mexico, and wages actually increased because wages in the exporting sector of Mexico are approximately 40% higher than the rest of the economy. What did this mean for immigration? By the year 2010, we began to see a decline in the rates of immigration from Mexico to the United States, right? More Mexicans began over the last 8 years or so to come back to Mexico than the number that went to the United States. And this was a reflection of better economic conditions for the middle class and the working class in Mexico, so that they could actually either return from the United States to Mexico and find employment in the jobs generated by the North American Free Trade Agreement, or came back with their families to Mexico. One very important element to understand is that nowadays, Mexican immigration to the US is reducing, is sort of declining over time, but we have seen over the last 10 years an explosion of Central American immigration that crosses Mexico and goes into the United States. And this poses challenges both for the Central American migrants, for Mexico, and for the United States itself. What is interesting, just to close these opening remarks of where we are right now, what we see worldwide in a time of economic crisis is that anti-immigrant sentiment is on the rise. It's on the rise in developed countries and in developing countries alike. And as you know, the whole issue of the border wall was very controversial when President Trump brought it to the forefront of the Mexico-US relationship. It's perhaps the most controversial element in the Mexico-US relationship in the last 50 years, and it had quite a reverberation, a big impact in Mexico in terms of the perception of our relationship with the United States. But that didn't prevent us from going ahead and negotiating a brand new trade agreement with the US and Canada. And now that there's been a change of administration in the US and a new a narrative, at least from the new administration, that is showing more of an opening to solve jointly the immigration situation between Mexico, the US, and Central America, there is hope that there is more room for cooperation. One of the key elements that I'm sure my good friend Enrique Perret will touch upon is the fact that that huge presence of Mexicans in the United States, which is 24% of foreign-born residents in the United States come from Mexico. So you have, in addition to the legal residents from Mexico in the US, you have about 5.5 million undocumented Mexicans, which make up 51% of all undocumented workers in the US. And the Mexicans that are in the US send enormous amounts of remittances, of part of their income to their Mexican families. And that has been for many, many years a very important source of income for Mexicans whose relatives have gone to the United States. I'll leave it at that as an opening remark on the history of immigration, and open to continue our discussion, of course.
No, thank you. And actually, that's a very, I think that's you've left it at a very good point, because this is now, we've queued it up to where Enrique has a lot of professional and personal insights on the ecosystem that has actually developed along the border. And certainly, Enrique, could you talk to us about that cultural integration and life at the border? And then I know that you also could share some very interesting information about the impact of remittances.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. First of all, thank you, Masha, and thank you for this invitation to the Hudson River Museum. And congratulations on the new exhibit. I think it's a tremendous opportunity for everyone to understand better the factors of migration and some consequences, right? The border cantos, I think it's just amazing, from the title to everything, right? The instruments and everything. So yeah, I didn't mention, or in the bio, I never put that I'm from the border. I'm from a very small town in the border called Piedras Negras, Coahuila, Blackstone City, in the border with Eagle Pass, Texas, right? A very small community, but it's a community, right? Very integrated, Eagle Pass and Piedras Negras. I leave that town on when I was 18, and I moved to Monterrey for my bachelor. But actually, I'm returning tomorrow, and it's part of my life, right? The border is always part of your life. Once you understand what is happening in the border, I think it stick with you, right? So I'll take the second question first. The remittances last year, $41 billion arrived into Mexico from the U.S. From the Mexican diaspora, right? There are 33 million of Mexican Americans and Mexicans living in the U.S. that send this money to Mexico on a yearly basis. 2019 was 38 billion. So even in a pandemia crisis, they send more money to Mexico. Obviously, this money comes to a families, to the wife, the kids, friends, even for business, right? But it's a lot of money. It's the first. It's at the top of the income, let's say, that Mexico receives from abroad. The second one is foreign direct investment. Ken mentioned $35 billion coming into Mexico in 2018. And then you have tourism and other areas, other industries. When you take into consideration a state like Michoacán, for example, right? Or Puebla or Zacatecas, they are receiving something around $3 billion and $3.3 billion on a yearly basis. So, that's the income of, that's 50% of the income of the state, right? Michoacán is a very poor state in Mexico. We know very well Michoacán in the US because the avocado, right? They are the major growers of avocado and many other cultural things. But but remittances is probably the highest income of the state. More than 8 million families in Mexico receive part of these remittances. And obviously, it's also the impact that remittance has is also a factor for them not to look to migrate, right? All these families, all these kids receiving this money, in average $320. Well, it's a factor for them to stay. That's the impact of remittances. And we need to say that those remittances are the income of the worker, right? I mean, some Mexican living in Washington State working on the agribusiness, they're receiving their payment for their job, for their work, and they decided to send on a traditional channels, say bank or remeseros or an agency. They decided to send some money to their families. I'm sorry, Masha, you was about to say something.
No. I find this fascinating, and it also has a great impact not only on the economy of Mexico, but there. I know that this flow that we talked about before, in addition to the flow of funding between the countries, there's there's a flow of human traffic on a daily basis. Correct? That at the other part of this microculture that is taking place along the frontier is at least 600,000 students, correct, are flowing between the education systems. Am I correct?
Well, in the border, you have plenty of things happening on a daily basis, right? $1.5 billion crossing on products, around 200,000 trucks each day, both ways. 1.2 million people cross the border on a daily basis. I mean, that impact is huge, right? Right now, because of the pandemic, obviously a lot of restrictions in the border because COVID-19, that numbers are probably reduced, impacting both sides of the border, not only the Mexican side that can cross to the US, but obviously the impact on the businesses in the US side, because the Mexicans are not coming to for consumption. It's also huge. I mean, states like Texas and Arizona took a huge hit because these restrictions in the border. The bicultural, Masha, the bilingual spirit of the border is just amazing. When you travel to a city like El Paso, you cannot be in El Paso without taking into consideration Ciudad Juárez, right? In gastronomy, and food, on art, on business, education, like you said.
Well, and what you're naming right now they also contribute to incredible cultural exports. For example, the culinary traditions of the areas you just mentioned. These are followed internationally.
Totally. And you cannot say that the impacts is only for the border, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, at the end, impacts the whole country. I mean, from New York to Washington State, it's impacted by this culture, right? I mean, nobody can say that the Mexican cuisine is not in every table in the US. It's not only the border, but it's everything. And the same thing in the other side.
Absolutely. So this is
Oaxaca and Michoacan, obviously.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating, and I don't know if everyone in our audience understood the grand impact of that flow traveling between our two countries, which is part of daily life and the success of our countries. This brings me to a question I wanted to pose to Ken. So Mexico has some challenges that actually reflect the challenges that we're dealing with in the United States, and that is that it continues to have a great challenge in providing a decent quality of life for its poorest classes. And I know that this is something that you have thought a lot about professionally in terms of improving that. Could you give us an understanding of what's happening in terms of migration within the country of Mexico, and perhaps where you see the greatest challenges and where you see the greatest sources of optimism?
Absolutely, Masha. Thank you very much. There's some interesting numbers here. If you look at the fact that, as I mentioned, from the beginning of the 20th century, there's been a move towards rural exodus, so to speak, people moving from the Mexican countryside to the cities to try to find a living, ways to make a living. And we still have about 25% of Mexican population is rural, which is pretty high, compared to other countries in the world. One of the biggest challenges is that we have, as many analysts have said, different Mexicos, right? Different levels of development within Mexico. If you're in the financial centers of Monterrey or Mexico City, if you are in the sort of Silicon Valley equivalent near Zapopan in Jalisco, that does not compare at all with the levels of poverty that you find in the southeast of the nation that is comparable to some of the poorest countries in the world. So this disparity has led to uneven growth within Mexico. First of all, this migration towards the major urban centers over the last 100 years, basically Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey, which are the biggest cities. And a lot of this migration is coming primarily from the southeast. The 15 states of Mexico that are considered to be southeast states: Oaxaca, Chiapas, Tabasco, Veracruz, Campeche, the Yucatan Peninsula, which has a smaller population and pretty much survives a lot based on the tourism industry of Cancun and the whole Mayan Riviera. But those other states that I have mentioned, some of them, for example, Oaxaca has some over 500 municipalities. It's a densely populated, mostly indigenous areas where you can travel to these municipalities and you will hear a lot of local languages and many people that have not had contact really with the same type of life or culture that people in the big cities have, right?
I mean, and to jump in for a moment, that was one of the comments that came in through the chat was a question indeed about thinking about native tribes that are on the border and basically a whole Mesoamerican culture that exists there as well.
Absolutely, and these let's say the majority of the indigenous population is found to the central towards the south of the country. There are, of course, indigenous tribes throughout Mexico, the Yaquis in Sonora and many other places. And there's been a lot of, obviously, intermixing in terms of the indigenous tribes of Mexico with the Native Americans throughout the history. But what we've seen in terms of immigration is that it's mostly the population from the southeast of Mexico is moving north, whether to try to find work in the cities or in the big factory towns up north. That is the investments that I mentioned that are geared towards export or going to the United States, of course. And the average age, for example, of migrants from the south of Mexico is 36 years old, which is interesting because it's an age where you're in your prime in terms of professional activity, economic activity. And what they are doing is they're going to north to find economic opportunity. They're usually, if they mostly male, many times traveling alone, but oftentimes with their families. Either they go first and their families follow. And an interesting statistic is that a lot of these migrants from the south that have made it to the United States, they either have been able to stay in the United States and have had their kids being born in the US. What we have seen in the last 15 years is that a lot of Mexicans that were born in the United States from parents that arrived there as undocumented migrants are coming back to Mexico, either because they have found economic opportunity or because their families have been deported. So it's interesting to see that about the 1 million people, more or less, that are from the US living in Mexico, almost half of them are Mexicans that were born in the US because their parents went there and they either arrived there very young or were born in the US and became American citizens and are now in Mexico. So that gives you a sense of the back and forth of human lives across the border, and that obviously have an impact on both sides, both culturally and economically.
This is great. And so this, I think this is a very good place for you, Enrique, to talk about this. I know you delve into matters of education and that acculturation. So let's talk about that. There was, my understanding was at one point, there was almost a stigma of someone who had left Mexico and came to the United States. And you had, maybe the feeling was that perhaps the person had abandoned Mexico at the wrong time, or that they came to the United States and their purpose was to quickly assimilate, abandoning that past identity. Can you talk about what is happening now in daily life, but also what the impact on our education systems in both countries?
Yes, no, for sure. I mean, in the past, Ken talks about the 80s and 90s, right? And those people were the ones who left, right? The ones who left to go to the U.S. and they left also their families and land and many things in Mexico. But now the new generation, I think, when you talk with someone like a dreamer, for example, and I love to talk about the dreamers because they are, they are the future of a part of the future of the country, right? When you take into consideration that from the total amount of the dreamers, 800,000 registered on the DACA program, 20,000 of them are working on education, right? 40,000 of them are working on healthcare, right? Obviously, they are now part of the U.S. I mean, their lives, everything, their country, it's U.S. But they do see, for example, the language, Spanish, something good for them, a competitive advantage, for example. It's cool to speak Spanish. Maybe for their parents or their grandparents, that was not the idea, the context, right? Their grandparents try not to speak Spanish outside their homes because there were a lot of restrictions or a lot of racism and xenophobia and other things. So they try to forget at least part of their culture because they wanted to to merge with the U.S. society. Now that's not the context today. I think if you go from California again to Minnesota or Ohio and Idaho, you will find many places in which the Mexican people or people from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, they truly feel free to talk in their language, and I mean to talk Spanish in this case, and they feel that the society in U.S. are more open. Even they are trying. I know plenty of people, plenty of Americans that are trying to teach Spanish to their kids because they understand that Spanish is the second language of the U.S. and that in the nearly future, 10, 15 years, half of the population will speak Spanish, right? Yes, and that's something good. It's not something bad. It's something good. It's a competitive advantage. And if we understand that, so everything is going, on the right direction. You talk about education. I think I feel better in that sense. Obviously, the Hispanic community, it's behind the levels of education in the average level of education in the U.S. I think they're behind like 30% in every score or matrix. We need to improve that. That obviously is because the work of their parents, their communities in which they live, because lack of opportunities, because many things.
Yeah.
But I feel we are improving that.
Well, and we are seeing that certainly more and more in the art world, where we're recognizing artists are integrating their family histories and their countries of origin into their artwork, as opposed to setting it aside or trying to diminish it. It's actually now an open part. Of course, I don't need to tell both of you, there is a very rich cultural explosion in the art world in Mexico, and that certainly the neighbors to the north are taking full notice of. Ken, I think I'd be remiss in not bringing up something that, of course, is in the news right now, and that is that at the border, there are a lot of children who are being detained at the border. Can you give us some information from your perspective, in your many negotiations, your many dealings with situations such as this? What hope do we have? Where do you think the greatest possibilities are to resolve this? Essentially, it's a crisis for young children at the border.
Absolutely, yeah, without a doubt. And we have to understand that the fact that there was a change in regime in the US and now a democratic administration arriving, that doesn't mean that the problems of the border disappear immediately. In fact, there's a positive narrative from the administration, but if you look at any polls that talk about social and political issues in the US, anti-immigrant sentiment continues to be on the rise. That is just a fact. And I think the Biden administration will find it hard to move some of their key policies that they're promoting when it comes to immigration through the US Congress. That's going to be a challenge because it is just a reality. Most people, especially when there's economic hardship generally, they retrench, they start to look inwards, and they begin to look at immigrants. Goes in a wave, right, up and down throughout the years. Immigrants as the threat rather than enriching your society and a group that helps to create more opportunity. So what is happening on the ground? We have seen some positive impacts by the Biden administration and some of the executive orders that were signed. For example, for starters, no more funding for the border wall, which was a complete waste of resources in addition to what it means in terms of sending a signal to your southern neighbors. But in addition to that, there are cooperation efforts that have existed for many, many years, and this is important to understand it. The relationship between the Mexican and the US government on immigration, it's not all about confrontation. There's a lot of programs that look to facilitate dialogue between authorities, cooperation at the border. There's a group that works bilaterally to try to prevent violence at the border for migrants that are either waiting to cross, provide assistance when they cross. I mean, I think the wonderful exhibit that you have at the Hudson River Museum shows you the hardship of the reality of the people that have to leave their nation, their families, and they leave their belongings behind as they cross the border. And this is something that the exhibit rescues and shows to everybody. So there are government programs, consular cooperation. We have over 50 consulates of Mexico in the United States that provide assistance to Mexican migrants going into the US and needing assistance. And the same exists in terms of collaboration between the Mexican and US Department of State and the Mexican Foreign Ministry. So hopefully with a change of administration, with a more, let's say, open narrative to cooperation coming out of the US administration, more can be achieved on that end. Because I am convinced that at the end of the day, economic integration has advanced quite a bit in over the last 20 years between Mexico and the US through the NAFTA and now through the USMCA. But the reality is that way before that, we already had an enormous level of cultural integration. What you and Enrique were referring to as the life in the border, it's almost like a third country in between Mexico and the US that has just completely fluid access to each side, completely bilingual, culturally linked. I mean, that is what we should pursue in terms of our vision for the future. Cooperation and immigration at the end of the day will make our country safer, stronger, and richer.
Yeah, I think when I think about the United States education system, one of the areas, or two of the areas that I feel we must grow positively are language education as well as arts education. And language education, because I know in my case, learning Spanish has provided me with a passport around the world. It is a language that you can basically take with you really to everywhere. And you can certainly use it in wherever you are in New York. It gets daily play in my own life. And at the same time, arts education provides that critical thinking lens. And I think that that's something that we in the United States need to take very seriously in order to improve relationships, not only with Mexico, right, but with our neighbors around the world. This is something that gets diminished in our education systems to the detriment of our responsible social behavior internationally. What I want to ask you, I find it very interesting, just back to the economy, is that idea that when people from Mexico come to the United States, there was a lot of very interesting information in terms of the entrepreneurial spirit, right? In terms of business, that there are a lot of independent business owners. People come and work. Could you both of you speak to what that means? I guess I know it probably links back to remittances, but there's also something very interesting in terms of the contribution to the United States economy. I don't know who wants to take that first.
I mean, let me just say it. It's something that you can see in every country, right? Immigrants, obviously, because the know-how continues living in brains, right? I mean, if you want to see, you can type in Google how to make an iPhone, right? Or how to how to fix something, but you will not do it. You will look for the expert to do it, right? That's why you continue going to the doctor, even though in internet you can find how to fix something in your body. But so know-how continues living in the brain, and any country or no country can say that they can do everything, right? So immigration also works for that, right? When you think on industries, for example, in Mexico, the beer industry, the wine industry in Mexico, even the auto industry comes from outside Mexico, right?
Yes.
So every immigrant brings something to a new country, and there is another factor, because they don't have this social, net in the new town. They will look to create I mean, they will look to be an entrepreneur. They will try to create a new business, and that's what happened in plenty of regions of the US, from New York to Silicon Valley. 35% of the people living in Silicon Valley now didn't born in the US, right? So, and they are now the CEOs and the CTOs and the founder and the entrepreneur and the VC, the venture capital manager. And that's what happened, right? When you receive with an infrastructure immigrants, right?
Yes.
I always complain because Mexico is not that open. When you think, I mean, Mexico sent a lot of people to the U.S. and to other countries, but Mexico on percentage is one of the poorest, let's say, thinking on immigrants living in Mexico. It's just 1.2 million foreign-born residents living in Mexico. And from those 1.2 million, half of them, more than half, 800,000 are Americans, right? Mm-hmm. And from those, most of them are Mexican Americans, right? Mm-hmm. So I think immigrant, the spirit of the immigrant, it's very entrepreneurial, and that's something that if you channel that spirit in the right direction, you will receive amazing results.
That's fantastic. And actually, I have a question about those results and the ramifications. Ken, could you speak to this one? With I wrote down some of the information that Enrique was mentioning in terms of the number of people who identify as DACA. What about the rise of the political class that is happening in the United States? The people who have come from Mexico who are now participating more and more in political life. Can you talk about what that means?
Absolutely. And I think as the immigrant community of Mexicans in the United States becomes more and more mature, and you have second and third generation Mexican Americans in the United States, they automatically become more ingrained in the system, and that means in all aspects of society. We no longer have the stereotypical image of the Mexican who arrives, who's very poor, who's just going to work in the agricultural fields. You have people coming in from all walks of life. Many of them arrive in a very humble fashion with no money whatsoever, but they carve themselves a future in the United States, right? This idea of the entrepreneur, it's an interesting statistics that for Hispanics, especially Mexicans, are 25% more likely to own their own business in the United States. I think that is very important. And just in the last 10 years in the US, Latino business owners grew in numbers by 34%, right? So you're seeing this rise of an entrepreneurship class of Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States that are able themselves to get a better education than they could in Mexico, and certainly give more opportunities to their children. So these children of the first immigrants or the second immigrants to arrive in the United States are adopting values from Mexico, bringing their own culture, but also adapting key values in the US, which is, for example, social participation, advocacy, volunteer activity. So you're seeing, indeed, as you mentioned, the rise of a political class, also in academia, think tanks, that are bringing in a different perspective than we had from, let's say, an all-white or all-WASP viewpoint on academia or business or politics that we may have had 50 years ago in the US. And this, of course, helps. It helps because it provides more opportunity by virtue of having more and more legislators that are either the sons of immigrants or immigrants themselves. They will obviously bring to the forefront as priorities many of the issues that are of interest to their communities. And that's very important. That's something that we've seen a big rise in the US over the last 30 years. And I think that it also gives us hope as to how we can continue integrating cultures and society across the Mexico and US border.
Okay, thank you very much. And Enrique, in terms of your role right now at the US-Mexico Foundation, where do you feel you're going to focus your efforts, and where do you have the greatest optimism, greatest challenges or optimism? Where do you think right now your foundation can make the greatest impact in the relations between the United States and Mexico?
Yeah, I think there is a big challenge still, Masha, on closing the gap of understanding both countries, right? And the impact. I mean, Ken mentioned amazing statistics and amazing numbers of, you know, trade, investment, even cultural stuff, but nobody, I mean, yeah, there's still a big percentage of the US population and of the Mexican population that don't understand that, right? When you talk about trade and the impact of Mexican goods in, you know, in the gastronomy of US or the auto business or the aerospace industry, there is still a narrative against trade with Mexico, for example. For me, that's a huge challenge because creating more trade between Mexico and US is good for both countries. A more prosperous Mexico is good for the US, and a more prosperous US is good for Mexico. And
can I ask you, before you jump in, before we leave that particular topic, I know just this past week, there was a major announcement about a policy that has to do with the legalization of marijuana and the issues that Mexico will be one of the countries that is definitely thinking about how, you know, their role in the legal export of marijuana in the to the world. Yeah, how will that impact things?
The bill passed the Congress, the House, and still needs to go to the Senate. I think Ken said that in another panel that the devil are in the details, right? Yes. And we need to see the regulation and implementation of the bill on marijuana in Mexico. I think it's a good sign. I think there are several states in Mexico like Jalisco, Michoacan, that with a good regulation and a good implementation can take a huge value of this. Again, there are still a lot of voices in the country, a lot of opposition to that bill. We need to wait still a little bit more. But when you see some other, and I think best practices from some states in the US, like Colorado, they were taken into consideration in Mexico. And that's part. I mean, we cannot be in Mexico like an island, right? Just taking decisions on marijuana. This is something that we need to create a dialogue with the US, because at the end it's a community, right? North America, I see
right, and as you said, it's a conversation that is taking place in the United States as well, with certain states making those decisions before other states. So it's certainly a conversation that's happening in both of our countries.
Completely.
And so where do you see now, where do you feel your foundation or numerous businesses and foundations, and I'm going to pose this to both of you, where do you feel you should concentrate your efforts now in the near term, and that you're playing the long game, but what are you going to think about in the near term to make those long-term continued improvements to both the citizens of Mexico and those who are migrating?
Yeah, well, one is to close that gap of understanding, of knowledge, facts. We need to put the facts out there, and to talk with everyone. That's one. The second, on migration, we're focusing on DACA and the essential workers, right? I think the pandemic gave us a huge gift, right? To see, to understand more the essential workers, a lot of them undocumented workers in California or Florida, or I mean every state, and those workers needs to be understood by the U.S. Population as someone who is essential for us, right? And they deserve the path of a citizenship or a legal path in the U.S. That's another huge challenge for us. We need to tell stories, Masha, and I think that's something that you do a lot through the museum, through the channels of the museum. We need to tell the stories about the people, about the mother, the kid, about the teacher, you know. So we need to say that and say it out loud. Hopefully the implementation of public policy in both sides of the border that helps to create a better border towns. We need to ask for the smart borders. We need to ask for infrastructure. We need to ask for more technology in our border. We need to ask for more investment in our border.
Thank you. This is
a good border is good for both sides, right?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. It will be a win-win. Ken, how do you feel? And by the way, I just posted for everyone. I invite people who are here as part of this conversation to pose questions to us. I will be checking the chat now in case you want to ask particular questions. I actually want to acknowledge one that one of our attendees also was commenting on the long history of receiving immigrants, that Mexico has a very long history of receiving immigrants from Lebanese, Spanish, Chinese, South American, among others, and that those influences of immigration have shaped Mexican history as well. So thank you for whoever posted that comment. That is a very important point, is that Mexico is not just about immigration. It has a long history of receiving people, which has shaped the country and the culture. Thank you for that. Ken, what about you? As we're waiting for a few extra questions to come in, do you have a particular thought? Do your thoughts correspond with Enrique's about what the short-term focus should be for the long-term gains?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me talk a little bit about the challenges and the opportunities that I see. But first of all, referring to the question that was just posed that you alluded to, in my case, I am a Mexican of Lebanese and British origin. So Mexico is a country that was built by immigrants. You know, it's a country where you had immigration from all over the world, primarily, of course, Europe, but that there was a mixing with the indigenous groups here in Mexico, and that we created this great country that we have, and that we should not lose sight that immigration allows you to enrich a society, I think, to make it wealthier in all terms, not just economic, but also socially. So when you look at the challenges going forward, I think the most important challenge, and I will focus on Mexico, is basically that, Mexico needs to be able to provide the means for a successful and happy life for its population. That should be, of course, the number one directive that every government has. But in Mexico, we're still lacking that ability. We still have very different levels of development and opportunity depending on where you are born, what is your last name, what is your family background. And so for Mexico's rural poor and urban poor, we need to find new opportunities. We need to find public policies that are comprehensive, that focus on economic development, but also on health, education, making the long-term investments that may not have an immediate political impact, but for starters, we cannot have policies of austerity when it comes to health and when it comes to primary education. Those are things that, you know, Mexico should not be engaged in right now, and we are, unfortunately. So we need to have a long-term vision. And yes, of course, the international trade agreements where I've worked on all my life are very helpful in generating an open environment, attracting investment, generating export opportunities, and a lot of wealth for Mexico. But in and of themselves, they are not enough. They need to be accompanied by sound public policies inside of Mexico. Having said that, the optimistic part that I see, and that is linked to our relationship to the United States, is that we are seeing more and more cooperation, not just on the economic front, not just on the USMCA, for example, where there are things that we can do to improve. For example, we can, in the next revisions of the agreement, improve provisions on labor mobility to allow for more professions and more trades to be able to flow freely between Mexico, US, and Canada. And that provides enormous competitiveness to businesses in the three countries, and also to workers from all three countries. Mexico tried to push for this in the USMCA, but the Trump administration resisted any efforts, anything that sounded like immigration, like labor or whatever, politically, they didn't want to touch it. So I think that's the next frontier on the economic front. And then again, we can also cooperate on many different areas and social policies. On health, for example, I find it absurd that right now, you know, in the middle of this COVID crisis, we're finally getting to the vaccination in all three countries, but there hasn't been an effort to have a region-wide policy on COVID vaccination. The approach to COVID, to the COVID crisis, has been done independently for each one of the countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico.
Yes.
Deemed essential industries, how the lockdowns took place, who's getting vaccinated. And right now we're at a point in our relationship where we should have joint policies on health, not just on COVID and vaccination, but also, for example, accepting health insurances in all three countries, moving towards integration of educational systems and be able to take advantage of the student exchanges more than we do. And eventually, and I'm looking, you know, towards a horizon of 15 to 20 years, looking for a full economic integration, sort of like the European Union has, but you can never copy those models fully. It will have to be the North American Union model, let's say, where we're talking about joint economic policies, but also joint social policies in terms of development funds, in terms of education, health, and security initiatives. That would be sort of my ideal view of where we should be in the relationship in North America over the next 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. This helps us understand. Now, one of the things that I think sometimes people, when they listen to a talk like this, they realize, okay, that's what large government should do. Do you have any advice if there's someone on this call that now feels that they want to do their part, they want to make a difference themselves as an individual? Where would you recommend that they start to help our countries bridge the wall?
You want to go first?
Where is the moment for individual action that contributes to the greater good?
You start, Ken.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there's quite a few elements or organizations that allow you to participate actively in the social life between both countries. I mean, I think there are groups, for example, in the United States, the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, for example, that is located headquartered in DC, focuses a lot on helping young immigrants find educational opportunities, finding access to technology, studying the careers of the future in information technologies, coding, etc. I mean, you can get involved. I think it's perhaps easier or faster to find some of these organizations that are more community-based and grassroots in the United States, but in Mexico as well. I think, you know, with the National Immigration Institute, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and especially in the, if you are in the US and are interested in promoting a positive agenda of immigration, getting close to the Mexican consulates in the US is a very good idea. I mean, I think both from the Mexican government side, but also from academia, think tanks, and NGOs, there's quite a bit that as an individual you can do to contribute to a lot of these efforts. Perhaps Enrique can touch upon this, but I know that, for example, there are efforts in the US-Mexico Foundation on finding ways for making sure that the remittances that come into Mexico go into productive projects, for example,
Yes.
right? And ensuring that that we can have more of a linkage economically between our countries, but that also helps the majority of society. So opening up opportunities, especially for the rural and the urban poor.
Thank you very much. And I think that you've actually touched upon one of the questions in the chat was, what's the next step between our governments for deeper integration? So that you've touched upon that. Enrique, what are your thoughts? What if someone is on this call or listens to this recording later and comes to Border Cantos and feels moved to do something, not just to be a passive observer of migration, but to actually make a positive contribution, what do you recommend?
Yeah, I think there are plenty of channels. I mean, from art, right? Participating on a Saturday in a conversation like this. Getting information. There is a lot of lack of information about migration. You see the news and you see 4,000 kids in lockdown in the border. And you feel that, very, far away from you in some place called Matamoros or some place called El Paso, and potentially you don't feel related, but it can impact your life, because at the end, one of those kids can be, the kid or the children of two immigrants working on a restaurant close to your house, or those stories are not far away from your states or your cities. So get involved. I think through education, it's the simplest way. For sure, there is a charter school close to your house. For sure, there is a Hispanic community close to your house. The consulate, like as Ken says, they are always trying to educate, to get information to the Hispanic community or the Mexican Americans. On the financial system also, there is a big challenge for them to be part of the financial system in the US, to get a bank account, to get a credit. Small businesses from the Hispanic community, for sure, they right now, because the COVID-19, they have a huge challenge. They are super resilient, but they have a huge challenge to get a credit or a loan, for example. So there are plenty of ways to participate.
Thank you very much. I know that right in our own city of Yonkers, the Mexican and Mexican American community have absolutely contributed to the vibrancy of civic life, of public life, of entrepreneurial life. It would not be the city of Yonkers without contributions by Mexicans and Mexican Americans. I'm going to ask you one last question. I guess what I'd ask is maybe we limit the response to about 60 seconds, just to give each other that closing remark. Well, about 60, maybe a little more. Just a closing thought for us today. Ken, I'm going to give it to you and just say, here we are thinking about Border Cantos. We're thinking about a lot that is happening in very real time between our countries. Policies that we're going through, this past week, as we mentioned, issues that are taking place right at the border, live with real people. What's your 60-second summary of what we should be thinking about?
Well, first of all, congratulating you for the exhibit on Border Cantos, for doing an event like the one we're doing today, because I think this is a step in the right direction. I think having as many events that raise awareness, that raise consciousness, that provides, as Enrique said, hard data, facts about the reality between what immigration is between Mexico and the US, and especially how it contributes to creating wealth between our nations. And as I said, it's not just on the economic and trade front, it's also socially and culturally. I think that making events like this more accessible to people is a very good start. I'm optimistic, as I said, with the change of administration in the US, with hopefully more cooperation at the government level. But as we all know, it really starts with the citizens, right? It really starts with mouth to mouth, explaining what Mexicans really are, what they are not, what their contribution is when they go to the United States, and how we all benefit as a nation and as a region from having a more constructive approach to immigration. And just in closing, I think it's very positive that both the administrations of Mexico and the US are beginning to seriously talk about tackling the core roots of immigration. The reasons why people leave their places of origin is because they don't have economic opportunity. That leads to insecurity, that leads to lack of educational opportunity. And so looking at this in a more comprehensive way, both to tackle those issues in the US and Mexico, but also in Central America, I'm sure will bring our nations together. And that's something that provides hope for the future. And hopefully we won't have backtracking of that in the future. What we've seen in the past is that anti-immigrant sentiment goes back and forth, and we are in the middle of the worst crisis. So we really have to be very insistent in teaching people that immigration is something that benefits both our countries.
Beautifully and powerfully stated. Enrique, would you like to make a last comment to this panel from your perspective?
Yeah, totally. I'm super optimistic, Masha, about the new generation, both in the US and in Mexico. There is a huge opportunity, for example, right now happening with the mobility of talent, of workers, right? Because someone in San Francisco doesn't have now the restriction to go to a physical office in San Francisco. Many people are traveling to cities in Mexico for good, right? Cities like Mérida, like San Miguel de Allende, Los Cabos, Cancun. So I'm seeing a lot of Americans, new generation, coming to Mexico, spending months there, working from there, but understanding better the relationship between Mexico and the US. So if we go ahead in 10, 15 years, I think we will have a big generation understanding better the needs and the potential of both countries and the interaction of both countries. I'm super optimistic about the border region. When you see what is happening in Tijuana, San Diego, Ciudad Juárez, El Paso, I mean, you need to be optimistic because they are just, thriving and creating a huge community. And thanks again, Masha, because this is a huge opportunity for us to express these, these ideas and as Ken said, these facts and this information that I think is it's important for everyone.
Well, thank you so much. And again, that is also beautifully and optimistically stated. And we need that right now. We need that optimism. Enrique Perret, Erhard, I'd like to thank you. And Ken Smith Ramos, thank you. Gracias. I will take this opportunity to, first of all, thank our staff, because of course you're thanking me, but truly this exhibition and all of these programs will be carried out by the amazing team at the Hudson River Museum. I would like to also remind everyone that Border Cantos Sonic Border will be on view at the Hudson River Museum through May 9th. This is a poignant exhibition, a powerful exhibition with fine art photography by Richard Misrock, who has dedicated 4 decades of his career to documenting the deserts, alongside Guillermo Galindo, who is an experimental sculptor and composer who has very poignantly created instruments, original instruments and original scores using articles that were left at the border. And it really is an experience. And I hope that everyone here will also feel very much invited and welcome to leave their own personal or family or ancestor story about migration in the exhibition. What we've seen has been just incredible and a powerful reminder that our country, both of our countries, have been enriched by migration and will continue to be so. So I want to say on behalf of everyone at the Hudson River Museum, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our esteemed panelists. And thank you for the reality as well as the sense of optimism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.